Hey everybody, I'm Dan Lapel for New Focus Recordings. Very happy to be joined by Adam Roberts, wonderful composer and the artist behind our release on Friday, Bell Threads, which is a portrait album of his work featuring some really great performers and play, Maya Bernardo and Hannah Levinson on violin and viola. We have the Jack Quartet with oboist Eric Baer. We have Hannah Lash on harp and Beethoven, Carl Larson piano, Matt Evans percussion, and Pat Swoboda on bass. How's it going, Adam?
I'm great. Thanks, Dan. It's great to be here and talking with you about this album.
Yeah, likewise. It's beautiful material. Really covers a lot of different territory, but all sort of unified by what I hear as the Adam Roberts sound.
What is that? What is the Adam Roberts
Well,
sound?
yeah, that's a. I don't know. Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
What I heard, at least when I was sort of listening to it and trying to come up with some copy, uh, was sort of penchant for anchoring on one musical parameter while sort of turning around and examining another.
hmm
Um, I don't know if that's a awkward mischaracterization of your process or not, but I felt that I was sort of hearing that in some of these pieces. How does that strike you?
I mean, I love that. When you wrote that and I got the copy, I was like, oh, that's so smart sounding. And I think it's right, but I'm not 100% sure what it means.
Ah, okay.
But
Well,
I think I sort of, yeah.
no, go ahead. Go, keep on going.
Well, I was trying to explain it to myself, and I thought I understood what it meant in the sense that I'm aware that I get into these sections where the material is a little OCD. I latch onto some kind of material and it's undergoing some kind of process, and there is an intense focus on something, and that thing could be different things. But that while that's happening, sort of the focus on that one element allows for freedom to explore, transform in some other domain. Is that kind of what you meant?
Yeah, that's exactly what I meant. Like
Yeah.
if I think about shift differential, the opening piece on the record, you sort of establish this sort of quasi harmonic series sonic area, right?
Yeah.
And then there's like this sort of melodic uh, weaving through that's very gestural and sort of, but the the harmonic series drone area is sort of stays constant as
hmm
a sort of frame for uh, that sort of more gestural motivic exploration, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess that's a somewhat sort of on the surface mundane example, but it popped in my head. But I feel like the way that this manifests itself in the pieces on this record, really it's very engaging. I always feel like you're sort of pushing the listener's ear in terms of like different ways to look at an idea, a musical idea.
hmm
Uh, but it's all very with a lot of continuity. I guess that's maybe the main point. Like there's this sort of linear continuity to how you're presenting these ideas that I find to be very easy to follow musically.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that, my ear tends to connect things, and I think one of the ways that I've dealt with that is by, you know, playing with materials that are quite different from each other and somehow getting one thing to turn into the next.
right.
And something that Seth Brodsky picked up on in the prefatory essay that I wasn't even necessarily totally aware that I was doing, but he kind of cornered this idea as the main idea of his essay, is that there's this idea of the temporal glitch in a lot of these pieces where, because continuity is not like an assumption in new music, right? There are plenty of composers who just want to fracture everything and write nonlinear music. So
Right.
continuity maybe is even sort of a framed feature of this work because it kind of stands out as something that doesn't necessarily happen all the time. But but he said that he finds, you know, himself getting to moments in almost all of these pieces, or all of these pieces, where it's like, how did I get here? Like, it was the temporal line was so strong, but suddenly I realized that I'm in some other material, and I'm not sure exactly how I got here.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed thinking that might be true,
Right.
that there was a sleight of hand happening,
Yeah.
where, you know, I mean, I am aware that there are these contrasting materials that are happening in some, you know, in the pieces, or these kind of changes from one state to another, but it nearly is always happening smoothly.
Right. No, I think that's a great point. Like you do arrive at these sort of aesthetic cognitive dissonances in a way, but the way
Yeah,
you get there is very incremental and it's very continuous, I think.
yeah,
Like the first movement of the oboe quartet has a moment exactly like this. I was listening to it just before we hopped on the Zoom, where it goes from this very sort of percolating dialogue, chamber music texture to these sort of like wild glisses a little
yeah,
bit, right?
yeah,
And all of a sudden you're just like, wait, yeah, I thought I was listening to. Well, let's talk about this piece a little bit, give some
yeah,
context. Is it so you wrote it as a companion to be performed on the same program as the Mozart oboe quartet, right?
yeah.
Um, how what was that like? I mean, that in itself feels like a fairly restrictive condition for a new piece, but maybe
Yeah, it
that's a
is. I
welcome one.
mean,
I don't know.
sorry, what was the last thing you said?
Maybe it's a welcome restriction.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm the kind of composer that enjoys generally enjoys these kinds of challenges, if I feel that, if I have this inner sensation that I'll be able to come up with something as a response, because I like the play that comes out of like responding to that context, or sort of the, you know, it kind of sometimes can free something up where I can start to riff in my mind about how I might respond to that context. But yeah, I think I got this commission in 2015 and wrote this piece in 2016, 17, and it was from the Society of Chamber Music in Rochester, and it was going to be played by Rochester Philharmonic players. So I knew that it was going to be played by excellent but musicians who focus on classical music, on the classical repertoire, and that they were going to play the Mozart oboe quartet in this program next to it. So I was thinking a lot about classical music with a capital C, as I write in the program note, and thinking about these players who were playing the music, and that it was going to live alongside Mozart. And that definitely informed the piece. I mean, I was thinking about how can I mean, the word that you use is sort of aesthetic cognitive dissonance, or that term is something that I think I gravitate towards as a creative force in my process a lot. So I think the idea of like, how can I take these materials that we think of more living in sort of modern, you know, contemporary composition, these sort of, you know, sol ponticello glissandi, and is it possible to use those in the frame of writing a response to Mozart in a way that, how would that feel? That question, or, you know, how would it feel to sort of take something from Mozart and also take these gestures that were just sort of living organically inside of me and find some way to kind of, and the idea wasn't to just stick them together. And this is maybe kind of an important point for all of the music on this disc, is I don't consider myself a postmodernist who's like commenting on the past in a way that's supposed to be ironic or funny. It's really like, can I take all of this information that's living inside of me and find a way with it somehow?
Yeah.
You know, sort of these, not sort of shut it out, sort of not say, well, I can't engage the classical impulses and I can't engage the, you know, is there a way for me to sort of, all of the stuff that's bubbling inside of myself, is there a way to move forward with it? And sometimes these bits seem like, you know, on the surface of things, kind of, you know, strange bedfellows, or, you know, mutually sort of contradictory elements or something like that. And I've learned in my process to lean into that, and actually that kind of excites me. It's sort of like, well, what's going to happen if we stick these things in the same piece? So in the Mozart, there are some, I mean, in the oboe quartet that I wrote, there are some direct material allusions to Mozart, but actually I don't think that's the most, I think the bigger thing as the frame of the piece itself, which is kind of a fast, slow, fast on the broadest. I mean, of course, it's more complex than that. The third movement in and of itself is not just a fast movement. It's fast and then frozen and fast and frozen, and then there's some, other stuff that happens. So this is an oversimplification, but there is the fast, slow, fast frame. And I think that what you said, about the way that the instruments work with each other, there is this chamber music kind of speaking to each other thing that we expect from this ensemble, and I fulfilled that expectation, quite a lot in the beginning. But then you're right that we get to these, at the end of this first section, it just opens up into these more wild glissandi, and then it suddenly feels like, wait a second, there's something being kind of stretched here.
Right.
And I like that, because to me, there's like a moment of consciousness on the part of the listener where they're going, wait, I thought it was in X country, and maybe the rules of this country are a little bit different than what I expected.
Yeah. Well, I think the point you made about your way of coming to this material as not really being like what we would associate with postmodernism, I think is an important one, because I totally agree that there's nothing pastiche or really collage. It's not jump cuts between sort of memeified stylistic ideas. It's really very much like you're in the weeds in this material, and you're sort of managing it and turning it around, and then it somehow finds its way organically to some other place. And that's the temporal glitch thing, I guess, that Seth was talking about.
Yeah.
Well, let's take a listen to the opening of the oboe quartet. Was it the opening, or
yeah, I was thinking,
yeah,
if we go over that seam, around that
yeah,
one mark. But yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, let's take a listen, and then we can come back after that. So this is the first movement of Adam Roberts's oboe quartet, performed by the Jack Quartet and Eric Baer on oboe. Wonderful. That's such a great excerpt. I mean, the whole piece is really, when actually the first time I heard it, I was imagining myself like in that concert, after hearing the Mozart. I guess I don't know whether or not the Mozart was before or after, uh, but just imagining audiences sort of on this roller coaster ride a bit, a musical roller coaster ride, in terms of like giving them somewhat what they expect, and then all of a sudden really throwing them for a loop, and then bringing them back, and so I think it's a super effective piece on that level, and on many other levels too. Let's pivot to some very different kind of music that is on this CD, and that's one of the really cool things about it. It really migrates from a piece like the oboe quartet, which is really the most, as you say, capital C classical piece on the record, to the material for the duo and play, violin viola duo. Specifically, the longer piece that you wrote for them. There's another piece, shift differential, that you didn't write for them, but they took up, and their recording is heard on here on this album. But Diptych was a project that you guys initiated together, right? And it was written specifically for them. And while I feel like the this thing that we were talking about your process and the sort of anchoring on one parameter and a sort of, as you said, like an OCD like examination of some other uh, element is still present here. The actual materials are so drastically different than the oboe quartet because you're really getting into some sort of variegated sound, noise sounds on the instrument, a lot of scratch tones, a lot of sort of extended techniques. Uh, Talk about that side of your work because it's not actually for me. It's not super common to work with and interact with composers who, whether or not they can, are still interested in writing a piece like the oboe quartet, but also interested in writing a piece like what we're going to hear in Diptych.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I it'll be interesting to see, you know, if people listen to the full disc,
All right.
what they might think about it. If I wish I could talk to people listening to the full disc, because there are these surface elements in the pieces that are very contrasting. Although I think that what might, well, I was going to say what might connect them is tends, I think it's actually the thing that you said, there tends to be some kind of bold idea that gets sort of fixed, sort of sat upon and extended. I think in the case of Diptych, I see them, the thing that fascinated, the cornerstone sort of concept that I latched onto for this piece was a very, very simple one, which was the idea of this polarity of two elements. So it had nothing really to do with the materials of classical music or new music or what, it was the idea of what would these, and I was thinking about these older pieces by Beethoven, Opus 111, and some of these other two movement sonatas, which are sort of strange and sit in this relationship of each other where the sense of two-ness of these things balancing each other, there's an awkward sense of the balance maybe doesn't really happen. There's kind of an unfinished business element of it where there's one experience and a second experience, and then you're left to sort of wrestle with how they relate to each other. And there was something about that polarity that I was interested in working on this piece. I think that the first movement to me feels like it's kind of sitting still. It's like this chunk of sound. It starts with this very long sound where the two instruments play this D in octaves that is microtonally detuned, and they move from niente into this overpressure scratch sound and back over the course of a minute. And to me, that sets up this vocabulary of like, this piece is going to be about pitch, noise, touch, microtones. It just sort of like outlays kind of this frame of what you might hear in the piece, and the sense of the motion from nothing to noise and back is something that is actually, this idea of sort of touch and the spectrum of touch is very important to me in all the pieces, even though there are these other associations that come in and out. Also in the oboe quartet, I mean, even there it's true where you get these moments of things, these brief moments of things dissolving into noise. And so that spectrum is kind of one vocabulary element that's sort of like always in my mind as a possibility. The second movement is really, actually, I just called it a movement, but I tend not to like to call it a movement. I think of it as more as these two parts because they're called parts, the titles, because I don't like to think of it as necessarily one following another in time, although that's how they will always essentially be presented. But I think of them as more of an ideal listener holding them both in their mind at one time so they can sit with like sort of two panels on a wall. But the second part, as you wrote very astutely, presents these very, very basic elements, these basically tetrachords or scale fragments that are kind of generic material. But it does it with this way where I was very interested with what happens if we take these very simple elements and make them undergo radically different treatments. So like in the opening, time is slowed to almost a frozen moment, and these elements build up into these little dense crystals of clusters. So it's really not scales, it's clusters that just unfold in time very slowly. And some of them are microtonal, and we get to hear these shifting crystals in relationship to each other. And then they almost flow through the middle point of regular time into this very, very rapid sense of time where they become figuration. So there's these kind of two extremes where this very simple material is fed through these extremes of time. And the figuration takes over, and then other melodic fragments start to fly off of the figuration, and then the piece kind of goes from there. But yeah, that was sort of the obsession with the second movement of what kinds of processes and my favorite probably section of the piece is in the middle when they come back to some of these opening figures, but they're chasing each other heterophonically. So they're tumbling over each other and never able to align, and you end up getting these little intervals that are kind of flying off like sparks off of like a metal wheel or something like that. So
Cool. Uh, well, should we take a listen to the beginning of part one? Was that the spot you were thinking might be,
yeah,
or
I think that would be a great moment to
this
check out.
octave D situation that sort of migrates into overpressure, right? So here's the beginning of part one of Diptych, and we're hearing and play Maya Bernardo and Hannah Levinson. Great. One thing that sort of occurs to me in hearing that excerpt and also some other moments I think in your music is well, let me see if I can parse this right. Like I feel like when you evolve into more refined noise type textures, it's it's almost like it's a modulation. Like it sort of it feels like it very much grows out of uh, a context which is more grounded in like clearer pitch, um, as opposed to what I feel like I hear often, which is the sort of, and this isn't sort of value judgment one way or the other, uh, but it's like many composers that I'm ending up playing or hearing. It seems like the goal is to cultivate a sort of new extended technique sonic language and to sort of
Mhm.
have that be the universe, right?
Yeah,
Maybe sort of conventionally played pitches show up here and there, but they're sort of like coloring this thing that is mostly framed by some kind of newly discovered way of using an instrument or electronics or whatever. And there isn't this sense that extended technique and noise can be uh, almost like a sort of component of the counterpoint or a component of the harmony, you know?
yeah,
And I find, full disclosures, I find that very compelling in your music. And for
mhm,
me, it's, again, it's sort of something that just makes a lot of musical sense to me when I hear it.
yeah,
But I'm curious to hear what your reaction would be to.
yeah. I mean, I think I can't really address that question without going into my bio a little bit, which
Yeah.
is, that I am an American,
Right.
I don't really identify. I'm not like an American, like go,
Right,
USA.
right, right, right.
I was born and raised in Ohio, which is funny that I'm sitting in Ohio because I never necessarily meant to, it wasn't in my plans to come back and teach here. Because for those who might be hearing this who don't know me, I've also lived in Vienna and Boston and New York and Istanbul. And, so I've made my way to these other places. But when I got a teaching job, and it was back in Ohio.
Right.
So I'm back where I grew up, but I have these memories and experiences that I've had, and that's also included being in very different value systems around composition, in terms of aesthetic direction. So, I mean, one of my formative experiences was studying at Eastman, and one of the great things at Eastman was Brad Lubman was there. Shout out to Brad Lubman, who played everything. There was this sort of, I mean, there was probably a competitive sense among different aesthetics, but there was also the sense of excitement, at least for me, of getting to just hear Charles Warren and Steve Reich and Yanis Xenakis, all played by Music Indova. And so, and then as I sort of learned the world of new music, I learned, these different composers, and, Locke and Montrino, the sort of, those were sort of some of the, the hip, Europeans back 20 something years when I started graduate school or whatever, so in 2003, I started graduate school, and those are some of the, hip, European composers at the time in the States, which is sort of funny because they've, of course, been known in Europe for 30 years before that or whatever. So, but I mean, as I sort of absorbed some of these different aesthetic ideas, I found many of them very, very intriguing. I mean, spectral music was also an influence for sure, especially the music of Gerard Grisey. But one thing that, and I bring up this idea of being an American because one thing that I became aware of was that I didn't have the same rules inside of myself about these aesthetics that I seem to observe in some of the other composers. So in terms of like Vortex, for example, was very exciting, I think, in some ways, Vortex Temporum, because he was, a lot of spectral music has these long sounds, and then he engaged pulse and repetition in a way that was really more like a post-minimalist might do. And this was not something that a spectral composer did, generally speaking. And on the other hand, a minimalist composer tended to use very simple diatonic or extended diatonic harmony and wouldn't really engage these rich microtonal sonorities like a spectral composer might. So here was suddenly a piece that to me, I mean, I still grew up at a time, and it's interesting because my students seem to have, like, who are, much younger than me, have like no sense of taboo anymore whatsoever. Like, but I still grew up at a time when there were some, I felt there were some, aesthetic taboos, like a spectral composer didn't do pulse like that. So that was kind of exciting that it lived together in one piece. Or a minimalist composer, there were these frames around aesthetics, right? Where there were these kind of identities. And I think that as identity has opened up so much in our world in these past years, both in terms of personal identity or gender identity or aesthetic identity, I think there's this great influx now of variations of identity in all ways, including in music. But the world that I grew up in was one where there were still more defined identities around aesthetic. And I felt that I didn't believe them for myself necessarily, although I found them very strong in other composers. Like, I found it very strong how committed Lockenmann was, but I didn't believe that my music needed to necessarily go only in that direction. Yet at the same time, there were things that I found boring about certain other aesthetics, which I won't, name specifics, but as I pulled together my own language, I realized at a certain point that what I was going to have to do was I was not going to be able to know who I was very clearly in terms of I am this kind of composer, and therefore this is what I do.
Yeah.
So it was a much more organic process of, like, I also felt like I was an American, but I had the privilege of travel and sort of experience. So I got to live in Vienna at a young age, and go to Wien Modern, and I got to live in Istanbul for several years and absorb microtonal harmony in the streets of Istanbul and things like this. So I had these really rich experiences that were sort of flooding through my system, and I thought, this is my path as a composer is to do some of these things that I'm aware that some other composers might not do. like a composer who writes noisy music might never write the second movement of my oboe quartet, which is much more melodic and diatonic than some of the other tracks on the disc. But that felt like a very important piece for me to write at the time that I wrote it.
Yeah.
The opening of Happy Angry Music seems to engage minimalism in some way, but the piece itself is not a minimalist piece.
Right.
I don't think.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's been kind of my path, is to also revel sometimes in the aesthetic, you know, taboos or the complications of taking something that might sound like a post-minimalist, you know, opening of Happy Angry Music and allowing it to then turn into what to me sounds more like a spectral cascade of, you know, sound. And I'm aware of some of these labels happening as I'm writing, and it's interesting for me. I'm not, you know, they're not the sort of necessarily the most important things, but I'm sort of, they're passing as kind of characters, aesthetic characters in my imagination. So yeah, I think to answer your question, I think that the way that I've integrated noise into my music is as an element that is something that lives alongside other elements that might not live in other composers' music.
Right. Great. That's a great answer. I mean, I have another thought about it, but I think maybe let's listen to a little more music first, and then we can. So let's listen to an excerpt from the piece you just mentioned, "Happy Angry Music," for piano, bass, and drums. This is Beethoven, and here it is. Great. That's a really exciting piece, and I definitely hear what you mean. Um, sort of minimalism going into, or sort of post minimalism, or a suggestion of it going into
Yeah.
something else. And I think maybe that seems to be emerging as a theme too, of like a sort of setting up a certain aesthetic expectation, and then it migrates somewhere else over the course of it. Um, a certain kind of restlessness that I personally also feel like I can relate to, and I wondered as you were talking just now about how you sort of, well, the way in was how you manage noise, but a general sort of sense of integrating all these different parts of your sort of musical self, right?
Mm.
A lot of times I think that the only reason there's a tension there for a lot of, and I think this is something that a lot of musicians feel, certainly a lot of people I know feel exactly what you're
Mm.
talking about. I think a lot of that tension is driven by economics. It's driven by this sort of pressure to associate with a tribe, because
Mm.
you know that that association with that tribe might generate or garner certain support with respect to grant. I mean, like it's very hard in a grant application to explain what's happening in your oboe quartet
Yeah.
without taking the actual time to listen to it. And we all know that most panels don't take time to really listen to a full piece, right? So instead, we have an industry that is, for better or worse, largely driven by like buzzwords that associate you with certain aesthetic stances.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
that leaves a lot of the rest of us, both I think as composers and players. I'm speaking more from the point of view of player, though I try to run the label in this way too. Um, a little bit out to sea if you don't necessarily ascribe to the idea uh, that being a sort of creative artist is about finding your sort of one dogmatic. I'm really putting a negative spin on this, and I don't mean to, because actually there are several artists who do that, who go very deep into one very specific corner of the musical universe and
Yeah,
do it wonderfully, and I can listen to and appreciate their work forever, you know.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
but that's a certain kind of orientation. That's a certain kind of musical personality, and I don't think it fits everybody. But we don't seem to have. Well, I don't know. You tell me if you think this is true. Like at least in contemporary music, in the economy of contemporary music, I think it really drives people to codify their work in these very sort of boxy terms. Are you a spectralist? Are you a minimalist? Are you? I mean, we had the now totally tired debate over are you an atonalist or are you like
Yeah,
that's over gratefully I think for the most part. Are you a microtonalist? Are you a timbrelist? Like, uh, I mean, none of those things. All that does is really encourage sort of one-dimensional approach to writing or playing with respect to these different musical parameters. You know?
yeah. I mean, I think also, I mean, the way that the entire world is going now, with like these Instagram reels, or I mean, I'm not even on Instagram, but somehow they're showing up in my Facebook feed,
Yeah.
it's like these sort of the TikTok and everything. It's like the momentary reward of being able to sort of grab attention and with something trending is like unprecedentedly high, even if the thing literally has no intrinsic value whatsoever. So I think this pressure to sort of present yourself, we feel that I think in the world at large, like in a way where it sort of grabs attention. But I think in a deeper level, I think that the world of whatever we call what we do, contemporary classical music or contemporary music or new music or whatever, is very fractured geographically and culturally. So I mean, I do think that there are these, things happen in specific places. I mean, spectral music happened in Paris and maybe also in Romania, in Bucharest, where there
Right.
were these other composers who were never quite as maybe recognized by the Parisians. But I mean, there were these, or, there's very wonderful, long-standing German new music festivals who tend to want, very noisy avant-garde, but stuff like lives in places, right? So,
Sure.
so we're aware that sort of, I think it's hard not to be aware of the world as a composer, and to be sort to, of course, have the natural desire to um, have your music live somewhere. So I think that you're right that whether it's the economy of money or the economy of just getting your music to live, which is a very, I think, natural, human
Yeah, I
impulse.
mean, when I say money, we should probably take that word with a grain of salt here.
Yeah,
It's the economy of a paltry amount of money that might support your work, but uh, I guess, yeah. I mean, I think you're right. It's all, and maybe it's naive to think that this is new because in every era of music history, in any music culture, we would always see a certain context that people had to work within in order to get their music played or to play music or whatever. I mean, there are sources of support, whether or not they be the church, the aristocracy, uh, publishing houses, whatever. So, I don't mean to suggest um, that there's something inherently nefarious about it, but I do think that maybe it's because we're exposed to so many different kinds of music and so many choices as musicians that the sort of pressure to narrow yourself down and to sort of say, well, this is the thing I do, and that might help to sort of uh, gain the attention of somebody who is involved with making some of those decisions about presenting or giving grant money or whatever. That pressure is fairly strong because it really Otherwise, you're sort of out in the desert in a way, like with your music that's hard to talk about in a soundbite, you know?
Which is precisely where I feel that I am,
Right.
sort of out in the desert with this music, where I feel like to engage with it kind of on a deeper than surface level, someone probably not needs to listen to the album and think about these how these things might or might not connect, and so but that's also, I mean, where I want to be, and I
Yeah.
sort of understand that, I'm sort of willing to live with it and hope that it kind of finds its people, and it feels, you know authentic, whatever that word means. I sort of recoil a little bit at that word, but whatever the, we need to find a way of moving forward that feels like we believe in what we're doing and have, and some kind of integrity, and um and so, yeah. And I'm also very, despite these particular challenges, or sort of these identities, that we're talking about, I feel very fortunate to work with these absolutely amazing people, and that's a model of working that I've carried with me since, I was very young. I mean, since being at least a student at Eastman, where I just said to, my friend Justin Colley, who's a great viola player living in Germany, I said, "Can I write you a concerto?" And he said yes, and I wrote him this big concerto, and then we just played it. I mean, it was just sort of, we got the school orchestra to play it, and so, I mean, that kind of collaborative spirit, and Jack Quartet was there at Eastman before they were Jack Quartet at that time. There was this real sense of, like, let's just make music together. And so for me, that's always been kind of the driving force, is connect with people who you want to work with, and make a music that feels real and urgent, and then put it out, and sort of let the chips fall where they may. I
Yeah.
feel like that's the work of a composer, and it's the work of everyone else to sort of sort it out.
Absolutely. No, and we are the beneficiaries of that. Very, for me, that is it's a route to a certain kind of musical richness that I certainly hear in this album and your work in general, and it's very exciting, and I'm grateful to know it. So thank you, and I think on that note, maybe we can wrap up and encourage people to listen to the album. It's coming out on this Friday on November 19th. It's called Bell Threads FCR 312. And let's give a shout out to some of the great people involved behind the scenes. Ryan Strieber, Octave and Audio, as always, did an amazing job recording, editing, and mastering the album. And with assistance from Charles Mueller and Edwin Hewitt. Mark Wolf, our trusty webmaster and designer, did the cover art and design. And we have some uh, photos by people that I don't think any of us know, but we made sure to credit them on the website. So, um, and before I forget, you're having a really exciting CD release event at One Rivington in Lower East Side, Chinatown,
Yes.
on December 13th. You said, right?
Yes, December 13th. We will lock down a time for that soon. I think it's probably going to be 8 p.m. And we'll have half the album. Hannah Lash will actually give the world premiere of Rounds. She's never played it for an audience.
Cool.
And Ann Play will play the two duos, and also Hannah Levinson of Ann Play will play the solo viola piece. So we'll have four pieces from the disc on that concert.
Fantastic. It sounds like a
And
great concert.
before we wrap up, just to piggyback on what you said, I want to say thank you to Ryan and to Mark Wolf, Ryan Strieber and Mark Wolf, because we had several rounds of work and edits, and they were very patient as we refined the disc to the point that it is. So thank you for your
Great.
patience and hard work. And
Yeah.
Dan, thank you for providing the space to get the music out. I'm very grateful that the space exists and that I have a chance to share it through this avenue. So
Well, the gratitude is mutual, Adam. So thanks again. Congrats. And look forward to seeing you soon in person.
sounds great.
All
Great
right.
talking
Take
with
care,
you.
everybody. Bye.